Hello, this is Georgina Rose,
This is Nike.
This is Anthony.
and welcome to Magnolias and Magick. In this episode, we're going to be talking about another sort of dichotomy. We've talked a lot about dichotomies, and most of the time we talk about how dichotomies don't exist, but I thought this would be a really interesting one to discuss, and that would be between orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Those are some big words, and we're going to get into the definition of them, but basically, this question is spirituality based around doctrine and spirituality based around practice. As a cultist, I think this is a sort of thing that we kind of struggle with and deal with in our practices, especially if you're someone who's left a sort of church-based situation. It can feel like you've gone from orthodoxy straight into orthopraxy, but in reality, things are a little bit more complicated. So we're going to talk about sort of what's it like being in a doctrine-based spiritual system, what it's like being in a practice-based spiritual system, the occult community's relationship to doctrine, and if maybe some doctrine could actually be good for us. What our universal experience is as a community. Could we ever agree on that? The relationship between unverified personal gnosis or personal experiences in the occult orthopraxy and orthodoxy, the idea of cross-checking with other practitioners, and our personal takes and experiences that have led us towards either of these perspectives, and sort of how to blend them both, or if you should pick one or the other. As well, I just want to tag this little announcement on at the end of this. We have officially, as of one day after this episode releases to the public, I'm pretty sure I'm doing that math right, maybe, have been doing this podcast for 2 years. On March 4th, that is the 2-year anniversary of when our first episode released. It's not currently still public as we took some of our early episodes down, but we have been doing this as a weekly and recently now once every other week podcast for 2 years straight. So thank you for sticking around, and that means a lot to us, and we're deeply grateful for you guys. So let's break into it.
So, Georgina, you're our resident isms, and we already got through the isms, but do you think that I'm going to jump off the outline entirely? Do you think that it's important to know these terms, or is it more important to understand the concepts without knowing the words behind them? Because sometimes I think we get lost in the isms.
I think that you don't necessarily need to know these terms, but I think they're actually helpful. So I've known what the word orthodoxy means for a long time. Like, there are even entire religions that have like Orthodox sects, like Orthodox Judaism, Orthodox Christianity. I always kind of knew Orthodox was like by the book, kind of that foundation, the root. But the word orthopraxy, I had never heard until I was reading Traditional Wicca by Thorne Mooney. It was the first time I'd ever seen that word used, and it described Wicca as an orthopraxy, a practice-based religion. And I remember reading that, and I was like, that's really interesting, because I had never really thought of that as a dichotomy. I'd known what orthodoxy was and sort of how that relates to my practice, because in Thelema, we have a really complicated relationship to orthodoxy, with a lot of Thelemites sort of completely rejecting any form of orthodoxy and other ones kind of clinging to it. And there's that sort of tension in our community. I like these terms. I think they're ones that are really useful. But I mean, you don't need to like know the ism per se to get the point. I think understanding like the relationship between your practice, between what is doctrine, what is text, what is understanding, versus what is your experience is an important thing to think about and conceptualize.
Mm-hmm. And if I can jump in there too, like something that I was thinking about as well is I actually didn't even have this thought until Georgina was doing her opening monologue, but basically, like I get what you're saying, Nike, about how like we can get lost in the isms and get lost in like trying to categorize a lot of these very abstract concepts within our community. But for me specifically, like with these two words, like I also knew what orthodoxy was for a very long time because I was introduced to that kind of vocabulary through Catholicism. But until like Georgina pitched the idea of like this episode, I had never heard of orthopraxy before, and it made me reevaluate my relationship with my past a little bit, like because I was like, oh, orthodoxy, everything according to the Bible, that makes more sense. I always just thought that it meant like traditional, like you have to do whatever the rules tell you to do, but like orthodoxy versus orthopraxy, it helped me to contextualize those a little bit. And it actually, like I said a couple seconds ago, it helped me realize this problem that I've been having in my craft ever since I started practicing, where I didn't have a good way of conceptualizing why my like pagan spirituality feels so different from how my Christian spirituality felt as a child. And like that's exactly what it is like I'm doing all of this on the fly based on my practice and like whatever we have like in our canon of occult literature, but like I'm not doing anything based off of a doctrine. And like that's the perfect like I feel like I'm just winging it in a way. And so like being able to contextualize it and name that problem, actually I'm like, oh my god, like it all makes fucking sense now.
Well, I think it's also the relationship of holy text, right? Because when we talk about what is the orthodoxy, I think that's the first question. Because orthodoxy, of course, there is a level of tradition to orthodoxy, but orthodoxy is the doctrine. So,
Mm-hmm.
what is the doctrine? In Thelema, we have a very clear one. It's the holy text of Thelema and the Book of the Law. But when we look at other traditions, it gets a little more tricky, right? Like in Norse paganism, they have like the Eddas and the Havamal. But you
Mm-hmm.
know, I think different subtypes of Norse pagans would define what the doctrine is differently. I think if you're talking about a tradition like Wicca, even individual covens are going to have different doctrine, right? And like, is doctrine just a holy text, like say Aradia, or is it what you're taught? Because it almost makes you think about how in Kabbalah there's in mystic sides of Judaism there's the written tradition and the oral tradition, but both of those are still kind of doctrines because you're
Right.
still being told them, and so it raises up that question like what is within your practice the orthodoxy? Because I think every tradition does have the orthodoxy to it. But I think
Mm-hmm.
like what it is, and I think one of those big things that is different, because obviously I would say Christian traditions lean harder towards orthodoxy versus orthopraxy, whereas pagan ones lean harder to orthopraxy. But I don't think any one tradition is fully on one side of this aisle.
Right,
And so
because there's like a point where you could argue that just having like guiding because like one thing I was thinking about was they were describing when I was doing research on like examples of each one that kept coming up was Taoism as an example of orthopraxy, because the whole thing is based on like living in accordance with the Tao, which has like all these moral repercussions for how you live your life. And what they were saying is like it's difficult to categorize it as an orthodoxy or an orthopraxy, though usually academically it's considered an orthopraxy. But it's difficult because there's almost a point where you could say that those guidelines, like not necessarily unspoken but like unwritten guidelines, form a basis of doctrine that could then qualify it as an orthodoxy.
Well, and I've always been the opposite of like very orthopraxic versus orthodoxic, and being a little bit more orthodoxic recently has been my big flip. Because so many people I know come from orthodoxy and being told how to do things, and
Mm-hmm.
it's just never been me. But now that I'm getting more into the actual religious side of things and getting into like the Havamal and all that kind of stuff, that's where the orthodoxy starts to come in for me, which in a way has been liberating in a different sense, because it does feel nice to have like a guideline if you're unsure and you kind of want to see what wisdom you can have. Now granted, I don't have to follow it blindly. If I think on it and don't agree, I don't agree. But I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there's wisdom to be gleaned from a lot of these official texts, regardless of religion. There are good values to be found, at least in part, in some of these religious texts. It could be good for people to have a place to start thinking about it if they really just need something. And I think that's okay. I think we sometimes look down on that and say that you shouldn't have people telling you how to feel about things. It's like, well, if it's a complicated moral issue and you don't have a starting place, it can be your starting place.
That's what I was trying to say earlier about like my Christian spirituality versus like my pagan spirituality. Like especially with paganism or like just occultism, like so much of this has to do with like interpreting abstract parts of like the human experience and trying to come up with a way to like engage with that ritually. And like so much of that is metaphorical, so much of that is abstract even within like other people's books explaining occultism. And so I didn't have a lot of markers like you said to like hook onto, to be like, okay, I'm not going off the deep end. Like this is what like I'm supposed to be like starting to see spirits like in my mind's eye and blah blah blah. Like, oh, I'm supposed to be talking to my rocks and crystals and shit. Like these are things that are normal. This is our faith. Like this is what the practice actually is. And versus like in Christianity, all of those are fed to you like basically since you enter the church. So like it's very easy to take those for granted. But in paganism, it was almost like a form of like culture shock because like I didn't have any of that. You have to make up almost everything entirely by yourself.
well, I think we're getting into what I'm deciding to coin in this moment as boomerang paganism. So, when you leave, and we're going to use Christianity as the example because Christianity is the most dominant religion in the West. So, we're going to use it as an example, and it is the most common one that I see this phenomenon emerge from. Right. So, you've left Christianity, specifically people with a more stricter form of Christianity, and they get into paganism and they Boomerang. They go I guess pendulum swing makes me more sense than a boomerang. You get what I mean. They go the hard other direction. Whereas they've left orthodoxy, but they've created a new orthodoxy. There's a term for
Yeah.
this in Thelema that a blogger named Intelakaya recently came up with called consensus Thelema. Consensus Thelema is that you cannot interpret Thelema for other people. Thelema can be what you want it to be, but this has become so rigid as a principle that it's silenced any sort of dissent and has thus not eliminated orthodoxy at all. It's created the new orthodoxy. The new orthodoxy is just a mirror of the previous orthodoxy, creating the same conditions again, but going in the other direction. You see this with a few things in the pagan community. They end up, instead of like, breaking down what happened in the Abrahamic spaces that we've sort of moved away from, but they've just created the mirror of that and have created just as strict restrictions and orthodoxies, which that doesn't fix the problem. It just creates, and I'm not saying orthodoxy problem, I'm not using problem necessarily, but it creates the same effect. And so I think sometimes almost seeking out orthopraxy can just create reverse orthodoxy. And I think that's also something to keep in mind.
Oh, you see this 100% in like the anti-baneful stuff. Like you can only do things that help people. Baneful workings are always bad in every circumstance, and it becomes like hardline opinions, hardline stances on you can't do this, you must do this. We saw that with like you can't blow out your candles, you must give offerings this way, and you can't give this offering, and it has to be done this way, and you have to read it in this way, and like we just end up with pagan versions of that, and at the same, like we have such a weird relationship with it, because at the same time that we're saying all of this, there are these rules. You must follow the rule of 3. You must give offerings this way. You must like snuff out your candles, not blow them out. You also have people saying every practice is valid, and the two don't coincide. If every practice is valid, but also snuffing your candles is the only way, then how is it every practice is valid? And so we have both at the same time, and it becomes this ideological conflict within our own community, sometimes from the same people. And that's where things get interesting.
Well, everyone likes this pretty idea that every practice is valid, but I don't think anyone actually thinks that. I think people are just afraid to admit that they don't think that. No, hear me out. Every single let's say you fully believe every single spiritual practice is valid. Period. I can bet you money that every single person listening to this has at least one thing that they think is invalid. Let's use some examples. If you think cultural appropriation is bad, you can't say every practice is valid. Right. Those don't coexist. You can't think that closed practices exist and say every practice is valid, right? That contradicts. You can't say every practice is valid and then think that you shouldn't fucking put selenite yoni eggs up your vagina, right? That's someone's practice. Right? So
I don't folkism. You can't say every practice is valid, but also say folkism is bad, because folkism has
it's a practice.
Roots. Like it is a practice.
You can't just disagree with something and then go, because clearly we all have limits, right? Every single person has certain things that they think are like not valid. Yeah. So I say we throw out this expression that every practice is valid. I think you can be kind to people and admit that like sometimes people are wrong. Because saying every practice is valid, I mean, that once again, it creates a new sort of thought terminating statement, right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, my thoughts on that too is like I used to say that all the time when I first started practicing, especially if I was like teaching beginners at the time. I say that when I started practicing and teaching, after I had been practicing for about 4 or 5 years, and I started teaching some of my friends who were interested. That was like something I emphasized a lot, was like every practice is valid, blah 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 blah. But as I've gotten older, I've had the chance to mature that thought a little bit, and I realize now what I was actually trying to say is that everyone is capable of having a personal connection to spirituality. Like everyone has the ability to receive, like I didn't have words for this, but everyone has the ability to come up with their own UPG. They have their ability to design their own rituals, to create their own connection to deity. Like all of that is valid. But the actual practice that you do, like that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work. That doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be right or that it will make sense to literally anyone except for you. And so like I think like every practice is valid. If we say that like publicly, we need to put a little asterisk next to it that just like a little footnote or something that explains the addendum, because I do agree now, like after so many years of practicing, like I completely agree with you. I don't think every single practice is valid, but I do think think that everybody has the capability of building their own unique practice.
Yeah, and I think UPG is at the core of this conversation. For those who don't know, UPG is unverified personal gnosis. It's your personal experiences.
Right.
For what that looks like is when you do a ritual, when you pray, when you meditate, whatever it is that you do, you have that personal interaction. Even Christians, even your Catholics, y'all have UPG.
Yep.
When you talk to God, when you pray, when you honor the saints, that's UPG too. You may not use the word, but it's the same thing. And that is sort of the core of this conversation and what orthopraxy is. Because orthopraxy, if you're going to go by that definition, that's using your practice to guide your spirituality, it's using your UPG as the lead.
Right.
And even if you are someone who has a holy text or a doctrine you follow, in a lot of ways that UPG does still tend to lead, because your personal experiences are something that, it's hard to. That's the thing. There's a really good quote called by Crowley that says, "Success be thy proof." Nothing convinces people of spirituality more than UPG and their own personal experiences. That's how people work. That's how we think. That's just how we're made, right? Like, I fully believe, contrary to what the internet likes to say, feelings don't care about your facts, right? Your emotions lead the way people think. And so even if someone claims to be orthodox, typically orthopraxy is how they decide what orthodoxy they want to follow. So people have their UPG, they have their moment of revelation, and from that revelation, they then sort of pick their doctrine. That's what I've noticed happens the most. And so in a way, like, UPG guides even orthodoxy. Like, UPG is like the core of it all, in my opinion.
Well, and this ties back a little bit to the point I was saying earlier, too. Like, it makes me, like, I don't know if we actually have an answer for this, but it makes me wonder, like, is there a point where your UPG can become such a guiding force in your own craft, or, like, in your spiritual practice, that it could be considered doctrine? Like, is that a thing? Am I interpreting that right or no?
I think personal doctrine maybe, although I think typically when we refer to doctrine, it's more about like a formalized
like a universal
system. Yeah.
For like a whole group of practitioners.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you create your own tradition, yes. I know that there are plenty of people that we know. Like, I'm pretty sure Christopher Penchak made his own tradition, right?
Right. And
Yeah,
so,
so, like,
his UPG in that circumstance would then
doctrine.
become the orthodoxy. Interesting. Okay.
Or Jason Miller's classes. So his classes have like a very specific way you're supposed to do things, and this is the way the class runs. You need to do things this way for the class to be able to make sense, for this all to work together. And so in the context of that class, that is doctrine.
Well, it sort of raises the question of what even makes UPG not UPG. I saw a meme forever ago, and I know I'm citing a meme. Hear me out. So there's this meme format where there's a moon and an earth, and there's like an astronaut pointing at another astronaut. And it's like, it's all blank. And the meme was religion, and it says, it was all UPG, and then it says after that, it was all UPG all along. And so, isn't all religion just UPG that's been quote unquote verified? How does it even get verified? Because typically what verified gnosis means, blue checkmark gnosis, whatever you want to call it, is verified because people have had experiences that sort of lend themselves to the same conclusion, and so they just kind of all decide it's true. Right? There's a term called scientific illuminism, which is where you like base your spiritual practice around like a scientific method. Even then, it's not the same as science. So there's no like scientific way to verify gnosis. So in a way, you could argue that every single religion is just UPG that people have kind of collectively agreed upon, but still it's UPG. So it's like, at what point does UPG become religion? How many people need to agree on an idea or an experience for it to be true? And so then it becomes that sort of broader question that I don't even know how to fully answer.
Well, I mean, I'm interested to look at it the other way too. Like, what's the value then of calling it unverified personal gnosis? Like, on a personal level, like it's just to clarify that like this is not going to step on anyone else's toes in the community, or like just to be able to like as a free rein to say like I can believe whatever I want as long as it stays contained to my practice, or like I don't know a lot about this term, I guess.
I don't know. I mean, it's kind of a colloquial term. I don't know if there's like an academic definition for UPG. I mean, I didn't hear it until I was in the occult community.
Same.
Really?
So I mean, is it an academic term? Let's look that up. I think it's just a pagan term.
I've only seen the
personal gnosis. It has a Wikipedia page.
In Western polytheism. Okay, so it's a pagan term. It says Yeah, so it's just a pagan. It looks like Susan Greenwood, I don't know who that is, has written about it.
Mm-hmm.
They must be some anthropologist, it seems. Okay, so it's not really like a super established term outside of paganism. So maybe that
Interesting.
does,
So
once
this
again,
is like just our little baby. Interesting.
yeah, so maybe this gets into this whole broader conversation of pagans, as we are so independent and content on not stepping on each other's toes and not created doctrine, have made a term to avoid asserting any sort of objective truth.
So the
Because,
existence of UPG as a concept is our doctrine.
yeah, well, if you think about it, isn't the existence of this term that clarifies that it's only my experience, doesn't have to do with you, imply that it does exist to be polite, so that people's
Right.
personal experiences don't contradict and you don't have to think about that? Because I think
Mm-hmm.
that in of itself does say something about our community if that's really what it's from. I
Right,
still like the
exactly.
term, but I guess
I
I've
do
never really
too.
heard of like a Muslim praying to God and being like, well, God told me that's my UPG, you know?
Right. But the thing you said though about how it exists in other religions though, that is absolutely true and I have like very very personal experience with that because I was raised by my grandparents. My grandfather was Catholic, which is where I get my Catholic background, but my grandmother, she was not Catholic. She is Korean full gospel, which essentially is like a Korean version of a Pentecostal church, and they have a lot of UPG like orthopraxic things that they do in their faith. And one of the things that she used to tell me about when I was little was there is like a certain point in the church where you reach a certain age, a certain level of devotion to God, and you start to learn. I don't know the word that she used because she used a Korean word for it, but it's essentially like angelic speak. You get to a point where you're so devoted and so faithful that you then develop like this own little personal language that you speak with exclusively to God when you pray. And it's like it's literally like I've listened to my grandma speak in this for like 10 minutes before and it's just gibberish, but it's like a repeating type of gibberish where like it forms like patterns and like sentences and like all these things that she's able to understand. And like the only thing I can compare it to is like in Hecate and Magic we have a thing called Vocis Magicae, which is just like gibberish speak from that's it's like a mixture of like ancient Latin, ancient Greek, and a couple other gibberish words that we use to speak to deities. And like she's doing that in essentially a Pentecostal church. And that's not written in the Bible. That's not like talked about by their pastors. But she said her and all of her friends and everyone else in her church does that. And that's just like a thing they do.
It kind of reminds me of two things. First of all, there's a thing in the Bornless ritual, which is a Thelemic kind of ritual, that are called the Barbarous Names. And Crowley has a chapter
Yeah.
about this in Magic Without Tears. Or no, in Magic in Theory and Practice, not Magic Without Tears. Sorry for confusing them. But he has a chapter where he talks about it, and it's essentially like they're not real words, but they are magical words. And so when you say them, you have to just say it with your full gut and not even try to pronounce them correctly, just like go with it. It also reminds me of Enochian, because what
Right.
Enochian essentially was is John Dee and Edward Kelly, two mystics, basically discovered an entire angelic language that they spoke to the angels to. I mean, could you not argue that that's essentially become the same thing, but it's become, since it was instead of just used by an individual, taught to numerous people, become the verified blue checkmark gnosis equivalent of it? Like, it's kind of the same thing if you really think about it. And so it's interesting. I think that, UPG is in every tradition. Um, because fundamentally spirituality is this thing. I've divided an occult practice into three limbs. This is my model. I came up with this when I was like in the shower one day. I think it's pretty good though. Probably should have said I came up with it in the shower. Probably
No, I
do.
love it. Those are where I do my best thinking. That's awesome.
Okay. So my shower thought three limbs of occultism are doctrine, reading things, researching, going to lectures, going to classes. 2, contemplation, thinking about your experiences, processing them, making sense of them, thinking about your ideas, doing introspection, shadow work, etc. 3, praxis, doing the thing, your personal spiritual experiences, the actual like doing of the thing. And those three limbs make up an occult practice together, and without each of them, it kind of sucks. So yeah.
You know what? Anthony, I'm thinking more about your point too. I see this a lot in Christianity, especially when it's like people saying, God told me this or that. I mean, we do see it
Mm-hmm.
in Christianity. They don't call it UPG. They say God
Mm-hmm.
spoke to them and told them this thing, directed
Yep.
them to whatever. Or People making new sects of Christianity. Fucking Joseph Smith. Let's look at that. That's entirely UPG. God told me this. God sent me these plates. God told me this is how it's supposed to be. This is the actual Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Like, that's entirely UPG that became doctrine. We see it
Right.
entirely there.
Well, Mormonism is interesting, and I've talked a lot about Mormonism recently. I've kind of been on a research kick. I'm not a Mormon, I just find it interesting. Let's talk about how occult this shit was. Okay, Joseph Smith was an occultist, my argument. So, Joseph Smith found these braided jasper crystals called seer stones that he used to locate treasure regularly. And then he realized that he could read the golden plates sent by God by holding them up to his eyes and scrying with them. And that is how he put them in a hat and held them up to his eyes and scried with them. That's how he recorded the Book of Mormon. And he claims that, first of all, a lot of early Mormons use these stones to scry. It's scrying. It's literally just scrying. Like, every description I read of this, I'm like, this is just scrying, bro. Into these little crystals that kind of look like crystal balls, I'm going to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And they believe that the church leaders still can get direct phone calls to God and, like, change church doctrine, whatever. Does that mean Mormonism is orthopraxy?
I would say so.
Yes.
It's definitely UPG at least.
I entirely believe that Mormonism is UPG.
Oh my gosh. I feel so
Truly.
bad we dog on Christianity like every week, but truly they are
But it's
just
not dogging on it. It is the truth. Like, this
it
is what
is
it
just
is.
the truth.
You think I'm dogging on the fact that there's an entire religion about scrying the Bible?
Like,
That
I am the number
wrote
one
this.
fan. I want to create a fan club.
So, as somebody who does not come from doctrine and is discovering it, my question for you guys is whether you think the community would benefit from doctrine, because I think it's complicated. I think that in many ways we both shy away from it and also jump headfirst into it for a variety of reasons. You know, we're looking for direction, we're looking for guidance, but also we are harmed by strong doctrine like from Christianity and other such things. So
Mhm.
there's both a desire for it, because oftentimes people do want direction from others. They want mentorship and leadership, but there's also that running away from it. And I think that we have to maybe find a balance with it, where doctrine as a starting point might be okay, or as a influence, but I don't think we should have doctrine being like the hardcore must have base. You know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
if you need help and you need direction, it can be good to see where these things influence and how they influence different cultures and different practices, but you don't have to stick to one rigid orthodoxy, one rigid doctrine in order to make things happen. But on the flip side of
Mhm.
things, for those who are flying without any form of doctrine at all, I think it can help to give structure. I mean, that's part of why we look into these practices, to have a structure. And in a certain sense, the way that a practice is meant to be run, regardless of religious value or not, regardless if it's actually religious or just practice, there is a baseline of doctrine to a certain degree. So whether we realize we're doing it or not, it is helpful.
I
Mhm.
think doctrine is good. That's my hot take. I think we always will have it, whether we admit it's doctrine or not. We'll always have something as doctrine, right? Like, in the community, we have norms. If you watch a beginner video by like 50 different people, the same stuff's going to be said multiple times. Whether we have it as a holy text or it's like unspoken things that we all agree upon, we already have doctrine. Like, we have it. There's no going away from it. To have absolutely no doctrine would just be like, you'd have to isolate yourself in like a cave and never interact with another human being and develop your spirituality that way. Like, doctrine is inevitably going to exist, and I think a level of doctrine is healthy. I think that we need, as people, a bit of structure, and I think that it's very arrogant to assume that we cannot learn from what other people's experiences are. I think it's pretty arrogant to assume that only our experiences are true and that only we could know the truth. I think that it's really important to actually learn from other people. That's why I stress like consuming other perspectives. I think that orthodoxy as well is not inherently good or bad. Orthodoxy is just the state of having doctrine. Doctrine can be good things or doctrine can be bad things. We've seen in many groups, some even full on cults, that have used doctrine in a very horrible way, right? To control people, to cause abuse. Like, doctrine can be used in bad ways, but doctrine can also be good. Doctrine can teach you lessons, can teach you how to be a good person, can teach you how to help the next generation. And so I think doctrine we should consider like a neutral thing. It depends on what the actual doctrine is, whether doctrine is good or bad, right? Like, what is the doctrine? I think that if doctrine goes too far and is too rigid, that creates a problem, because your personal gnosis and your personal experiences with the divine should be leading your spirituality, in my opinion. As a Thelemite, I think that will is the most important thing, and your will is obviously going to be discovered through personal gnosis. So I think, your gnosis should guide what doctrine you subscribe to, but I don't think doctrine is bad. I don't think it's necessarily like amazing. There have been bad doctrines. But, I think that doctrine's fine. I think on the bigger question, though, of will our community ever have a doctrine, I don't know if we're ever going to get the entire occult community to agree on anything. I think that's a little bit of a fatalistic project, but we can try.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, for me, I think the lens that I look at this through is, I guess this has just been on my mind a lot lately, of like how to teach the craft to like beginners, because I've been thinking a lot about like how to start creating content again. And so I guess that's the lens I'm approaching this through. And that is a problem in our community, is that like there isn't, there is doctrine. I do agree with you, Georgina, but there's not like standardized doctrine. Like there's not standardized canon or anything like that. And because of that, there are a lot of people that get, how do I want to say this? There are a lot of people that fall through the cracks, I guess, or like there's a lot of important concepts that often fall through the cracks. And you could read, like, just like you said, you could watch like 50 different beginner videos that'll all essentially say the same thing, but like very rarely do those things go in depth enough for someone to like truly internalize it the way that like you need to internalize some concepts in order to start building a meaningful occult spiritual path. And so if we were to have a type of standardized doctrine, that is like a problem that we could address in our community. It would help people get on the same page. I think it would help a lot of people not have so many arguments online or in person. It would help people clarify what they're trying to talk about when they try to talk about their spiritual experiences. But just like you said, like I hesitate to even say any of that, because our community is so big that like some people get offended if you just call it a community. Like there's so many different practices, so many different traditions, and like just within those, like I would dare say the majority of occult practitioners don't even belong to a tradition. They're just kind of like freewheeling it out there. And so like I just can't see a good way, like you said, of getting however many millions of people practice our general flavor of spirituality. There's no way to get them all on the same page, much less create any type of standardized doctrine that would fit every single one of their checkboxes that they want filled. And so within
I
that, like I just don't see how it would work.
I get to be the dissenting voice and say I don't think we should. I don't think the
Ooh.
pagan community should have a universal doctrine, because a lot of practices are going to go against each other. Norse paganism is
Exactly.
not going to have the same stuff as Greek paganism, is not going to have the same stuff as Thelema. And so trying to find one that works for all is not going to exist, because they're
Hmm.
all going to say opposite things or very different things and just different ways of doing it. There isn't a way to make it all. That's why it's an umbrella term to say the occult community or like religious practices or polytheism, because they're not able to all be the same thing. One pagan practice is vastly different from another, and you can't just try to make it universal, because in a way, this might be a controversial way to phrase it, but in a way that's very colonialist. You know what I mean?
It
Like trying to
is.
make everybody be the same. And it's like,
Exactly.
well, we can maybe have a value here or there that people can share. But I think that trying to have a universal doctrine erases the uniqueness of all of these traditions, especially ones
Hmm.
that have already struggled to be preserved in any way, shape, or form. So I don't
Exactly.
think that our community should be striving for something that is a universal doctrine. I think within practices you can. So maybe within all of Thelema, you can have your universal doctrines, and within all of Norse paganism, you can have your universal doctrines. But even just Norse paganism and Thelema, they're not going to have any universal doctrines that are going to be able to fit across the board.
I slightly
Exactly.
disagree with you. I'm gonna double dissent. So my counter is, I think that at the core of everything, we're all having the same experience with the same stuff. Because otherwise, how would so many different places have come up with so many, parallel traditions? I think that we are having an experience that we interpret in different ways and create doctrine around, but we are all inevitably experiencing the same spiritual experience. At the core of all of it, there's that root tradition. And to get to that root tradition that we're all experiencing, we have our own way of taking it. I think each culture filters things differently. I think they put it through their own lenses, but that core is the same.
I
I
think
think
that's very
there is.
emanationist, though. Like that comes down to the conversation we've had previously about like emanationist versus like hard versus soft polytheism. I think it comes down to that too, because I don't believe that we're all experiencing the same base thing. I think that there are larger ideas to a point, but even that you wouldn't necessarily agree on. Like you could maybe try to say we're all experiencing spirits and otherworldly things and divinity, but some wouldn't even say that. Some practices wouldn't even say that there are spirits, or maybe even that there is divinity. Some of it's very different.
It's the two different types of like beliefs in the occult. One believes in like actual magic, and one believes it's all just in your head. Yeah, the psych versus. So that's what I was thinking of while you were speaking, is like the psych versus spirit model. Like you can't even create. There's no way to create a doctrine that merges those two things, because like they are literally in praxis. In practice, they are literally doing the same thing, but like this experience that you're having underneath, it comes from two completely different places, and so like I don't know. I don't know. That's just a
Well,
thought I had that I wanted to bring up.
we're almost getting into a is postmodernism true discussion, because we're talking about, does truth exist? Is there
Right.
objective truth?
Do the lines all converge at some
And I
point?
personally think there is objective truth. I think Blavatsky was right in saying that the highest point of religion is truth, and we are all sort of striving that out, but we don't know the answer yet. But in the end, I mean, someone has to be right,
Mm-hmm.
right? Otherwise, it gets into a very interesting spirituality. But even if we get into an interesting spirituality where multiple religions are correct, there's still a through line to that. There's still a explanation for that. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that truth does exist. That's also why I don't think everything is valid. But I think that's sort of the discussion we've hit at this point. Like, is the postmodern idea that truth is dead something you can even apply to religion? I say no. I think Nike says yes. But yeah, that's a much deeper question.
Yeah, we got really far down the rabbit hole with this point. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh.
So, do you then think that we should be checking our own stuff against other people, because that can also be very difficult, is to say like, should you be making sure that you're doing things right compared to other people? And I think that's kind of a yes and no for me personally. Like, to an extent, yes. I think more if you're in the same tradition as somebody else, you can see how they're doing it. But even that, you're not going to necessarily think that they're always going to be right. I think
Mm-hmm.
if you want to cross check it with anything, you'd want to cross check it with source as much as you can. But if it's entirely UPG, then it's a little bit harder to cross check with source. I
Right.
think it can be good to observe, but to compare your own to others in a way of trying to see if you are wrong, I think that can be dangerous.
Yeah, and this is the addendum I would put on what I was saying earlier about how I think doctrine could be helpful for our community and like teaching people and getting everyone on the same page. This is the addendum I would put, is like when because that's never going to happen. I think comparing yourself to other people's practices is like the only thing we really have in a lot of ways, besides just like literally studying, but in a way like studying from books is essentially the same thing. And so like I think that comparison and like being able to compare notes with other practitioners is really all we have by way of like making sure we're all at least relatively on the same page. But I completely agree with you, Nike. Like there's a point where comparing just to make sure you're in the same ballpark could turn into like, oh my god, like I blew out my candle and now my spell's not going to work and my deities are going to leave me, and like you just start believing whatever anybody tells you. And so I think there has to be a healthy balance there, like you said, but I'm not personally sure where that balance is. I know where it is for me, but I know everybody's different.
I think comparison is hard. I think that it's a hard thing to do. I think that it has value to it. I think that comparing notes is extremely helpful, because
Right.
oftentimes you'll get together and you'll talk about UPG with people, and you'll notice that 4 or 5 people have like the exact same experience, right?
Hmm.
You'll say something like something corresponds to this, and everyone will be like, oh my God, it does for me too. Or I had the same sign. My teacup broke at the same time. That's so cool. And so I think there's value in it. I think the problem with comparison is that sometimes it can become toxic.
Yeah.
I think when you start going from, let's see where we agree, and you start getting into, am I doing spirituality right? Am I a failure? I don't know. It can get very, this is the thing. When you start comparing yourself to other people, it can sometimes lead to this like insecurity and
Hmm.
this sort of self attacking stuff. And that we really want to avoid. That's something that you definitely, that's not helpful. It's hard to not do sometimes. But
Hmm.
comparison's really difficult. I think that, there's value in talking with other people, but talk with them and remember that this is a light-hearted conversation, and
Hmm.
sort of have like boundaries with that. And also, there are certain things in your spiritual practice that I don't think you should share with other people. I think the term keep silent gets used in ways that I don't really like a lot of the time, but I think a little bit of keeping silent is good sometimes.
Absolutely. I think it's important to just keep the core of like your craft internalized, and like just protect that core. Like you can let all the ancillaries change and evolve, but like as long as you are still connected to your core belief, I think that's where you have to stay. And like the thing you were talking about too, about how comparison become toxic, the thing that immediately popped into my head was, this used to be talked a lot about online when occult talk, or I guess witch talk, became very, very popular. Or I actually, not even that, before that, on Instagram, when like witchcraft became popular and trendy on Instagram, a lot of people I knew who they had been practicing for years, who were very happy with their craft and their spirituality, who then would see occult influencers with these big fancy altars and like elaborate spreads and like all these very, very expensive things to have. Like they would be like, oh, is that what it's supposed to look like? Like what I'm doing is working, but like what they're doing is pretty and everyone seems to like it, and they really sound like they know what they're talking about. Like, should I be doing it that way? And so like I can see so many pitfalls where this has already happened in our community.
Yeah. Well, that happens with creators, like from the creator side. That happens to us a lot, where people will come to us and
Absolutely.
ask if they're doing things right or wrong by comparing themselves to your practice. Like, I saw you do this. Am I doing things wrong because I'm not doing that? No, you're just not doing it my way. It's fine. I don't do it half the way my friends do it anyway. What does it matter? So, from the opposite side, we see this a lot where you shouldn't be comparing yourself to other people, because what's going to work for me is not going to work for you. I live in
Mhm.
Minnesota. Temp lives in Florida. Our plants are not the same. She's not doing
Mhm.
spell work wrong because she's not using stuff that grows here and not there. And I'm not doing
Mhm.
things wrong because I don't have access to Spanish moss up here. Like,
Right. Well,
it's
I
not
mean,
wrong, it's just different.
another thing it makes me think of too is like, it's not like you just like take a test and learn so much about occultism and then suddenly one day you're like, yep, I am an occultist, verified, like blue check mark on Twitter, I know what I'm doing and this is how it will stay forever. It's like, no, like I did a spell the other day, unlike any other spell I've ever done before. Like every week my craft evolves essentially. Like I would argue that almost no two spells I do are the same. And so yeah, like what I post on Instagram now is going to be different than what I posted a year ago versus what I might be posting 10 years from now. So like you can't just see something on the internet and think that it is the truth, because like even to that person it's not necessarily like the absolute truth. It's just their best approximation of their spirituality at that moment.
Yeah. Do you want to do our favorite thing and do some hot takes?
I would love
Yeah.
to.
What are your UPG hot takes, y'all?
Saturn is not evil.
I
That's
feel like
true.
I've heard that
Saturn the
before.
god or Saturn the planet?
Saturn the god is not
Okay.
evil. All you neo-Gnostics. This is to the neo-Gnostic meme pages, okay? I'm directing this to neo-Gnostic meme pages. Y'all are equating Saturn with things that Saturn does not equate to. Stop it, get some help.
Blame Mars once in a while.
Blame Mars. Okay, Mars is the worst one out of two, just objectively. Yeah, that's my first hot take.
Excellent. Anthony?
I hesitate to say this because I don't have like any sources to back this up, but I guess that's the fucking point.
UPG!
UPG. So I don't even know how to completely put this into words. This is still very new to me, but it's been out of my work with Hecate. So I have been coming to this abstract idea that Hecate is not necessarily like an external force. Like it is an external force, but it is not necessarily like a deity the way I've worked with a lot of other deities, because when I work with her, I actually first noticed this when I did invocations of her. It didn't feel like I was invoking her from like anywhere outside of me. It felt like I was waking something up that was internal. And so I just kind of like went with it for a few years. And then after doing more research and talking to other Hecatean practitioners, I found out that that's also like their experience a lot of the time. When you invoke Hecate, it's not like you're invoking an external force, it's more like you're evoking an internal thing. And so over the years, as I've learned more about Thelema, a lot thanks to Georgina and a couple other types of occultism, I have come to the conclusion that Hecate is the same thing as the holy guardian angel or the higher self. And that,
Ooh,
yeah, and that's how I've been working with her for like about 6 months now. And so like I've
that's
Interesting.
just essentially combined the Bornless ritual with my Hecatean invocations, and that's what I do now.
That's
that's
interesting.
really cool.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the most important deity work for us to do is the stuff we want to do the least, and the stuff that makes us feel the most upset.
Very fucking that.
Oh,
Like-
true, very true.
People think, and granted, there are cases where this is true. I'm not saying that it is only this way, but I think that the notion of like my gods make me feel like they're very gentle and they're very parental and they take care of me. Like I'm sure that's true, but I think that you're not going to be going anywhere, and they're not necessarily helping you to grow. They might be helping you to find stable center, but you're not growing unless it hurts. Is my like real hot take. Freya has
Mm-hmm.
me doing my most important work by getting super upset, like putting the challenges that I hate, people that I don't want to be around, stuff I don't want to do, stuff that is painful to go through, stuff that like makes me feel like I'm about to be at my worst, and it ends up being
Mm-hmm.
transformative in that way. That
Yep.
is far more helpful for me than any god that's ever been like super comforting and gentle and feeling like they're rocking you to sleep. Like, yeah, that's all well and good, but that's not helping me any. Or at least it's
Mm-hmm.
not helping me to grow. It can help me go from a low point to come back to center, but I'm not going from center up if it's not hurting.
Also,
Exactly.
another thing I've noticed, this is my UPG. I don't know if you guys can relate to this. It's always the spirits that I never would have expected to work with long term that I end up working with long term.
Yep.
Without fail, like I started working with this one deity recently, and they're like a super obscure deity. And I invoked them on a whim on Yule because I read an article that they correspond to Yule, and I was like, sure, why not? They've stuck around this whole time. And I've done
Really?
a ton of workings with them, and I'm like, what the hell?
Mm-hmm.
Every time there are multiple gods and spirits, and just spirits in general, that I have wanted to work with and like liked their myths. And I try working with them, and they're like, haha, no. It's
Mm-hmm.
always the ones that I just don't expect. And then I'm like, okay then. And then it's like I develop this amazing relationship, but it's never the spirits that like I would, think.
Mm-hmm.
It's always the ones that I'll just do like one ritual with that I won't even have really planned for and just be like, and then they'll like this ritual I didn't plan for it. I wrote it like 5 seconds before I did it. And it was like the most transformative ritual I've done in years. And I
Yep.
was like, what?
Yep.
Remember afterwards I was like,
I have UPG to piggyback off of that. I have found in my own personal practice that doing things like trying to plan an elaborate ritual out very rarely works as well as a ritual that happens spontaneously, that I just like throw together in 5 minutes because I actually feel compelled to do it. And like I would tack that onto Georgina's.
I almost never plan my stuff, and it works out very well for me. I know I want to do it, and I have an idea of the baseline, but actually getting the correspondences down, I used to plan it so meticulously. Nah.
Nah.
I like planning things.
When the time is right, I will do it. That's my belief.
I
When
like
the time is right, my body will go, I can do it now.
Right.
I like planning things, but sometimes you need to be spontaneous. I agree.
Mm-hmm. And then helpful spirits like that show up sometimes, and then they
True.
don't leave.
Yeah.
All right.
So
Final thoughts?
yes, my final thoughts are this became a lot deeper of a discussion than I would have expected.
Hashtag deep.
Hashtag deep. We're a very deep podcast. We are so deep. But for real, like I think this is a thing that each person will have their own kind of relationship to. I think it's something to think about. I think knowing the words orthodoxy and orthopraxy is helpful. And I think the real truth is that, no religion is one. Every religion is in the center. I feel like every time I talk about like any sort of dichotomy, I'm always like, it's not real. But it's not real. I don't think any dichotomies exist, okay? I have concluded that there's no such thing as a dichotomy. It's a lie. It's a lie being pushed to you. I don't know by who. By the dichotomy people.
By big dichotomy.
By
The
big dichotomy.
big dichotomy is lying to you. That is all.
Perfect. My final thoughts are not have nuance, but have balance. I think there is a certain balance to be had between orthodoxy, orthopraxy, and when you have too much of either one, you become off kilter, and you will likely find some struggles in your practice, and you won't be advancing as fast as you could if you were able to balance the both of them. If you're able to take the doctrine and have that baseline, and then work off doctrine into UPG in praxis and finding your own way, I think that's the best way to go. Having the baseline helps, but sticking to it too rigidly is going to make you stunted.
I think my final thoughts are going to be heavily influenced by what I'm going through personally right now, because I am going through this right now. But it could be helpful if you are listening to just take a second to objectively examine your practice and what you're doing. And because this helped me so much, maybe look at it through this lens of what we're discussing this week of orthodoxy versus orthopraxy. Just take a look at what you do, what you believe, see how much of it is influenced by other people's doctrine or doctrine you subscribe to, see if there is is a doctrine that you subscribe to that maybe you don't consciously know about. Examine what practices you do just because you like to do them, what practices you do because they are tied to your core faith. And just, like I said, take a second to examine what you're doing and why you're doing it, and see if it's all actually in alignment with where you're at in life right now.
And patrons. I have you guys up actually for once. So every week we get to read off your names if you are the bud tier or higher because you help to keep the podcast going. So extra special thanks to Amy, Evan, Hamda, Jonah, Lita, Robin, not our Robin, different Robin, A Sociology of Tarot, Alejandra, Ali, Angry Pratt, Anna, Boxy, Bridget, Cirrus, Dot Nihilus, Doitsu, Frater Zygmunt, Lee, Leo, Lilith, Marcelo, Marshall, Mike, MK Scorpio 89, Nauseated, Neon, Neva, because now I know how to say your name, Nicole, Pamela, I think you're newer. Hi, Pamela. The Lady Ghost, and Victoria. Thanks to all of you guys for helping keep the show going.
And if you want to enable us to make more podcasts, because we're entering year 3, if I timed when this episode comes out correctly, if not, I'm sorry, March 24th, that's the day. You can join our Patreon. You get extended shows, extra shows, pre-shows, all the shows, your name read out, and our private Discord channels. And if you want to support me or find me other places, I do other things beside this show. I'm Georgina Rose, or Darling, a DAAT. You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, Twitch, and Telegram. I do have Odyssey and Vero. I don't use them, so I don't know why you'd follow me there. I mean, you can. You're welcome to, but I don't know why. My main platform is YouTube. I have the most fun on Telegram, though. And you can also find me on Patreon and support me and all that.
My name is Nike. You can find me at Witch Nike basically everywhere. I've been taking a little bit of a longer break from YouTube, and I've decided that I'm actually going to keep that break until I move on the 1st. So
That's
I'm going to
awesome.
keep that, but I'm going to be coming back, and I have, videos queued up to do things. Otherwise, you can find me on Instagram, Twitter at AstroWitch Nike. That's the one I've decided to be my main. And basically every platform. I mean, if you search, you'll find me. I'm around, so hit me up.
And I am Anthony Wolfe. If you would like to connect with me, I am at Anthony the Witch on Instagram and Twitter, and currently that is it, though I have finally been putting so many plans into motion to start pumping out more stuff in the next few months. So hopefully I will have more links for you soon, but so far it's just Instagram and Twitter.
Good.
And this has been Magnolias and Magick.